At the United Nations headquarters in New York, the gravity of war once again commanded the global stage. On September 16, 2025, Secretary-General António Guterres stepped before the cameras and delivered words that underscored both frustration and alarm over Israel's military campaign in Gaza. His remarks, broadcast from UN TV, carried a blunt message. Israel, in his view, appears determined to continue its war to the very end, regardless of calls for restraint. António Guterres said, "At the present moment, it looks like Israel is determined to go up to the end and not open to a serious negotiation for a ceasefire, with dramatic consequences from the Israeli point of view that it is also not allowing for the release of hostages that we have always said should be immediate and unconditional." Those words, lasting only seconds, encapsulated months of failed diplomacy and escalating violence. Guterres was not just reporting facts, he was sounding an alarm. By stressing that hostages should be released immediately and unconditionally, he reminded both Israel and Hamas of the obligations under international humanitarian law, while simultaneously highlighting the human toll of political deadlock. For Guterres, this was not a new role. Throughout the Gaza conflicts of recent years, he has consistently called for restraint, for humanitarian access, and for respect of international law. Yet his latest statement signals a sharp shift in tone. The message was not cautious or conciliatory. It was a lament that Israel, a UN member state, is simply not willing to engage in meaningful ceasefire negotiations. In diplomatic circles, such a declaration amounts to a warning. The war is beyond mediation, and the international community has little leverage left. The historical backdrop is essential here. Since late 2023, Israel and Hamas have been locked in cycles of violence that have claimed tens of thousands of lives, displaced hundreds of thousands more, and left Gaza in ruins. International aid groups have repeatedly described the situation as catastrophic, with food, fuel, and medicine unable to meet the scale of need. Each flare-up has been accompanied by calls for ceasefires, temporary truces, or negotiated pauses. But in nearly every instance, these arrangements collapsed under the weight of mistrust and renewed hostilities. What Guterres is now signalling is that Israel has made a conscious decision to continue the war until it achieves what its leaders define as victory, even at enormous human cost. Inside Gaza, the reality of this choice is evident. Rubble lines the streets where neighborhoods once stood. Civilians find themselves trapped in overcrowded shelters with little food and sporadic electricity. Aid convoys wait at sealed checkpoints, delayed or denied, even as hospitals struggle to function under bombardment. These are the dramatic consequences Guterres warned of, an unfolding humanitarian crisis exacerbated by political stalemate. At the same time, the UN Security Council has remained paralyzed. Ceasefire resolutions proposed by non-aligned states are vetoed by major powers, often split along predictable lines of alliance and opposition. For diplomats inside the chamber, the atmosphere is one of resignation, knowing the tools of the Council are blunt, yet unable to forge consensus. Against that backdrop, Guterres' statement outside the chamber takes on new weight. When the world's top diplomat speaks with such bluntness, it is because the formal mechanisms of diplomacy have stalled. Observers note that Guterres' choice of language matters deeply. To describe Israel as not open to serious negotiations is not a routine observation. It is a signal to the global community that, from the UN's perspective, there is no active peace track. It is also a way of applying public pressure. The Secretary-General, after all, has no army and no vote in the Security Council. His influence lies in the power of words and the moral authority of his office. By warning of consequences and urging hostage release, he is trying to shape the narrative and rally international opinion. The implications extend beyond Gaza. Across the Middle East, governments seized upon Guterres' statement to bolster their own positions. In Arab capitals, officials echoed his warning as proof that Israel was isolating itself, refusing to listen even to the United Nations. In Israel, government spokespeople quickly dismissed the remarks, portraying them as one-sided and arguing that Hamas's continued rocket attacks and hostage-taking left Israel no choice but to act decisively. The clash of these narratives underscores the depth of the geopolitical divide. Israel frames its campaign as defensive and necessary. Others see it as excessive, indiscriminate, and unsustainable. And yet, the hostage issue remains central. For Israel, the return of hostages is a non-negotiable priority. For Hamas, they are leverage. By insisting they be freed immediately and unconditionally, Guterres was reminding the world that human lives cannot be reduced to bargaining chips. But his lament that this demand is being ignored reinforces the sense of stalemate. Neither side is prepared to yield, and civilians bear the consequences. The Secretary-General's words also raise the broader question of international law. If wars can continue without ceasefires, if hostages remain pawns in negotiations that never materialize, what happens to the credibility of humanitarian norms? Guterres has spent much of his tenure defending the relevance of the UN in a fractured world. His remarks on Gaza are as much about the institution he leads as they are about the conflict itself. Without diplomacy, without negotiation, the UN risks becoming a bystander to war rather than an arbiter of peace. As analysts point out, the phrase "determined to go all the way" is stark. It suggests a military strategy aimed at absolute victory, regardless of the cost. For some Israelis, this resonates as strength, as proof that their government will not bend to international pressure. For others, it raises fears of endless war, of isolation, and of deepening regional instability. In Gaza, however, for ordinary civilians, the phrase translates into one reality: continued suffering, continued displacement, and continued uncertainty about tomorrow. In the coming weeks, the world will watch whether Guterres' warning gains traction. Will his words spur renewed calls for diplomacy? Will they galvanize humanitarian actors to push harder for access? Or will they be remembered as another plea lost in the noise of war? For now, his message is unambiguous. The path Israel has chosen leads not to dialogue, but to destruction, and the consequences will reverberate far beyond Gaza's borders. This was António Guterres at the United Nations, delivering not only a statement about Gaza, but a broader warning about the limits of diplomacy in times of war.